Hansel and Gretel. A long time ago, a brother and sister called Hansel and Gretel lived in a small cottage in the forest with their father, a poor woodcutter, and their stepmother. The woodcutter loved his children very much, but the stepmother was cruel and unkind. The family was so poor that there was hardly anything in the house to eat. The stepmother always filled her own plate first, so that poor Hansel and Gretel often shared just a crust of bread for their dinner. One night, the stepmother said to the poor woodcutter, "We have barely enough food for the weekend. We can't keep living like this. We need to send the children away, or else we will all starve." The woodcutter was clear. "We cannot send the children away," he answered. "I would miss them too much." But the wicked stepmother insisted that there was no other way. The children had to go. The woodcutter should take them into the deepest part of the forest and leave them there. They would not be able to find their way home, and they would be free of them forever. Hansel and Gretel were lying in bed, but they were not asleep. In fact, they had heard every word of the stepmother's plan. Gretel began to cry. She did not want to be lost in the dark wood and never see her father again. "Don't worry, Gretel," said Hansel. "I have an idea." As soon as he could be sure that their father and stepmother were asleep, Hansel got out of bed and crept out of the house. He gathered up some white pebbles and took them back inside. The next morning, the woodcutter told Hansel and Gretel that he must go into the forest to chop some wood and that they should go with him. They set off on a long walk deep into the forest. Hansel walked behind his sister and his father and quietly dropped the little white pebbles on the ground as he went, one at a time, until there was a trail of pebbles behind them. Soon the woodcutter told the children to wait for him whilst he chopped some wood. He left the children behind, but didn't come back for them, not even when it was dark. Gretel was worried. She didn't like being left alone in the forest in the dark. She was beginning to feel quite scared. There were lots of strange noises and she couldn't see where she was. "It's okay, Gretel," whispered Hansel. "Look." And he pointed to the white pebbles, which were now shining in the light of the moon. "I dropped those pebbles on our way here," he explained. "If we follow the trail, they will lead us back home." Gretel hugged her brother. "Oh, Hansel, what a clever idea!" she exclaimed, and the two of them walked eagerly, following the trail of pebbles. They walked for hours as they had been left behind deep in the forest, but finally, exhausted, they arrived at the little cottage just as the morning sun was rising. Their father was delighted to see them, but the stepmother was cross. She told the woodcutter that he must take the children back into the forest the very next day. That night, Hansel once again crept out of bed to fill his pockets with pebbles, but to his surprise, the door was locked. Disappointed, he went back to bed, telling his sister, "Don't worry, Gretel, we'll think of something." In the morning, the children once again set off into the forest with their father. The stepmother had given each child a small crust of bread for the journey. As they walked along, Hansel picked small crumbs of bread off his crust and dropped them onto the ground, just as he had done with the pebbles. Once again the woodcutter left the children, telling them that he would be back to collect them later. When night fell and their father had not returned, Hansel told Gretel of his plan to follow the trail of crumbs back to their little cottage. The moon was shining in the sky and the two children looked for the crumbs. They looked all over, but could not find them. the thousands of birds that lived in the forest had swooped down and eaten the crumbs. There was no trail left for Hansel and Gretel to follow. The brother and sister didn't know what to do, so they walked and they walked through the forest, hoping to find their way out. They were getting hungry too, for they had nothing to eat. They had finished Gretel's crust of bread a long time ago, and there weren't many berries on the bushes to eat. They stopped for a rest and woke up again when the sun began to rise. Wearily, they walked a little further. Soon they saw a little white bird high up in a tree. The bird was singing so sweetly that when it flapped its wings to fly away, the children decided to follow it. It wasn't long before the bird came to a stop outside a little house. As the children got closer to the house, they saw that it was made of gingerbread. Its little windows were made of clear sugar. Hansel and Gretel were so hungry, and the house of sweets was so tempting that they both reached out to it. Hansel picked a piece of gingerbread from the roof, and Gretel broke one of the sugar windows and began to lick it. The house tasted delicious. The two children were about to eat some more when a sweet voice called out, "Who's there? Come on in, dears." Hansel and Gretel pushed the door and went inside. A little old lady was sitting down in a rocking chair. They told her their story about getting lost in the forest and how hungry they were. "Well then," said the old lady, "I shall have to find you something more to eat, shan't I, lovelies?" She set a table and laid it with the most delicious goodies you can think of. There were pancakes, cupcakes with icing of all colours, bread and jam and gingerbread men. Hansel and Gretel ate the delicious treats without even coming up for air. When the children were full and rested, they said goodbye to the kind old lady and headed to the door, ready to try and find their way home again. However, when they went to open the door, it was locked. The old woman was a witch. She had trapped Hansel and Gretel in the house. She locked Hansel up in a tiny cage and made Gretel do all of the housework. Each day, she said to Gretel, "Make your brother some delicious tasty food. When he is fat and plump, he will taste good. Then I will eat him." Poor Gretel had no choice but to follow the witch's orders. Every day she swept and dusted and cooked food for the witch and Hansel. She was exhausted and sad. Each morning, the witch would tell Hansel to hold out his finger so that she could see if he was fat enough yet for her to eat. The witch was old and her eyesight was poor, so clever Hansel would hold out a little chicken bone instead. When the witch felt the bone, she would say, "My goodness, there's not enough fat on you yet to make a meal. Feed him up, Gretel." And she would leave the boy alone for another day. One day, however, the witch decided that she could not wait any longer. "Gretel," she shouted, "I'm going to eat this little boy today. The oven is on, but I need to make sure it is hot enough, or else he won't cook properly. Crawl inside and see if it is hot enough." Gretel went over to the oven. She knew just what the witch was planning. If she crawled into the oven, the witch would cook her as well. So Gretel turned to the witch and smiled sweetly. "I'm ever so sorry," she said, "but I don't know how to do it. How exactly do I get in there?" The witch, who was getting hungrier by the minute, lost her patience with the little girl. "You silly thing!" she screamed at Gretel. "The oven is huge. The door is enormous. There's plenty of space for anyone to crawl in there and see how hot it is. Why, even I can fit." And the witch put her head inside the oven door. As she did so, Gretel came up behind her and pushed her in, shutting the door tightly after her. Gretel rushed over to Hansel and unlocked the cage, setting him free. The two children hugged each other. they no longer had to fear the wicked witch. They went around the house, opening cupboards and drawers. They were amazed to find them all full of jewels and pearls. "These are much better than pebbles," exclaimed Hansel. The two children set to work stuffing their pockets with as much of the treasure as they could, before finally deciding that it was time to leave the gingerbread house. Hansel and Gretel wandered amongst the trees for a time, wondering if they would ever find their way home again. After a while, the forest began to look more and more familiar to them, and they soon realised that they knew exactly where they were. They could even see their little cottage in the distance. They ran as quickly as they could and didn't stop until they reached the front door. Their father opened the door and couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Hansel and Gretel standing there. He opened his arms wide and hugged them both. "Your stepmother has gone, children," he said. Hansel and Gretel showed their father the treasure that they had found at the witch's house and told him all about their adventure. The woodcutter hugged his children again, and they all danced around in happiness. Now they could afford to eat whatever they wanted. They lived together happily ever after in their little cottage in the forest.